Hey guys, tonight we dive into the unforgiving reality of Wild West survival, a world where death lurked around every corner and the American dream often became a waking nightmare. From the bone-chilling isolation to the constant threat of starvation, this story is brutal, heartbreaking, and haunting, a defining moment in American history that claimed countless lives. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what you think about the romanticized vision of the Wild West versus its harsh reality. Now, let's begin. The year is 1870, and you find yourself standing at the edge of what passes for civilization in the American frontier. The wooden sign marking the town limits of Redemption. Kansas creaks in the relentless wind. It's faded, letters barely visible through the layers of dust and grit that code everything in this godforsaken place. You've traveled for months to get here, selling everything you own back east for this chance at a new life, and now, as the reality of your decision settles into your bones like the pervasive cold of a prairie winter, you begin to understand the magnitude of what you've done. The smell hits you first, a nauseating mixture of horse manure, human waste, and rotting garbage that seems to hang in the air like a physical presence. There's no sewage system here, no organized way to deal with the detritus of human existence. People simply dump their waste wherever convenient, usually behind the ramshackle buildings or in the alleys between structures. The flies are everywhere, thick clouds of them that buzz around your face and settle on every exposed surface. You'll learn soon enough that these flies carry disease. Bad dysentery and typhoid fever spread through towns like this with terrifying speed, but for now, you simply try to breathe through your mouth and ignore the churning in your stomach. The main street, if you can call it that, is nothing more than a wide dirt path that turns to thick, sucking mud whenever it rains and transforms into a choking dust bowl during dry spells. Today, it's the latter, and every step you take sends up small clouds of fine particles that coat your clothes, your skin, your lungs. You can taste it, feel it grinding between your teeth. The locals have a name for it, prairie flower, and you'll soon discover that it infiltrates everything: your food, your water, your bed. There's no escaping it. It becomes part of you, settling into the creases of your skin until you can't remember what it felt like to be clean. As you walk down this excuse for a street, you notice the buildings on either side, hastily constructed affairs made from whatever materials could be scavenged or afforded. Some are built from rough-hewn logs, the gaps between them stuffed with mud and straw that constantly needs replacing. Others are mere soddy houses, constructed from blocks of prairie sod stacked like bricks. These structures might keep out some of the wind and rain, but they're breeding grounds for insects, snakes, and rodents. You'll learn that prairie rattlesnakes have a particular fondness for the cool, dark interiors of sod houses, and checking your patrol for venomous visitors becomes as routine as breathing. The people you pass on the street have a particular look about them, a hardness that goes beyond simple weathering. Their faces are prematurely aged, skin like leather from constant exposure to sun and wind. Their eyes hold a peculiar emptiness, as if they've seen too much and have simply stopped processing the horror of their daily existence. Women who might be 30 look 50, their bodies bent from endless labor, their hands gnarled and rough as any man's. The children, those who've survived, have an eerie stillness about them. They don't play like the children you remember from back east. Instead, they work alongside their parents, their small bodies already showing the signs of malnutrition and overwork. You notice the cemetery on the hill overlooking the town, and even from this distance, you can see it's disproportionately large for such a small settlement. Fresh graves dot the landscape, some marked with simple wooden crosses, others just mounds of dirt. You'll learn that death is a constant companion here, that the mortality rate in frontier towns like this can reach 30% in bad years. Children are particularly vulnerable: scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, and a dozen other diseases sweep through with seasonal regularity, taking the youngest and weakest first. The saying here is that a woman needs to birth 8 children to see 3 reach adulthood, and even that's considered optimistic. The general store, such as it is, reveals the true precariousness of frontier existence. The shelves are sparsely stocked with basic necessities, all priced at rates that would be considered criminal back east. A bag of flour that costs 50 cents in St. Louis sells for $5 here. Salt, sugar, coffee, all luxuries that most can't afford. The storekeeper, A calm man with suspicious eyes watches every customer like a hawk. Credit is extended grudgingly and at usurious rates. You'll learn that many families fall into debt to the general store and never escape, working themselves to death, trying to pay for basic necessities while interest compounds their misery. As evening approaches, you seek lodging and find your options limited to a boarding house that makes your skin crawl. Just looking at it, the proprietress, a widow named Mrs. Hutchins, shows you to a room that's little more than a closet with a straw-filled mattress on the floor. The walls are thin enough that you can hear every sound from the adjoining rooms: coughing, arguing, sobbing. The bedbugs make their presence known immediately, and you'll spend your first night in an exhausting battle against insects that seem infinite in number and appetite. Sleep, when it finally comes, is fitful and filled with dreams of the comfortable life you left behind. But perhaps the most unsettling realization comes as you lie there in the darkness, listening to the foreign sounds of this new world: the howling of wolves in the distance, the skittering of rats in the walls, the muffled weeping from somewhere down the hall. You understand with crystalline clarity that there's no going back. You've spent everything to get here. The return journey would cost money you don't have, and even if you could scrape together the funds, the shame of failure would be unbearable. You're trapped now, committed to this harsh existence, whether you survive it or not. The brutal truth of frontier life begins to reveal itself in these first hours. This isn't the land of opportunity promised in the guidebooks and newspaper advertisements that lured you west. This is a place where civilization's thin veneer has been stripped away, where the basic struggle for survival consumes every waking moment. The romance of the Wild West, the cowboys and adventure and wide-open freedom, is exposed as a cruel fiction. The reality is dirt and disease, violence and desperation, a daily fight against forces that seem determined to grind you down to nothing. As you finally drift into an uneasy sleep, you can't shake the feeling that you've made a terrible mistake, but it's too late now. You're here, in this unforgiving landscape where only the strongest and luckiest survive. Tomorrow, you'll begin the backbreaking work of trying to carve out an existence from this hostile land. Tonight, you simply try to rest, knowing that each dawn in the Wild West brings fresh challenges, new ways to suffer, and the constant specter of death hovering just outside your door. The harsh dawn of frontier life has begun, and there's no mercy to be found in its relentless progression. But to truly understand the brutal reality you now face, you need to remember how you got here, the journey itself, that merciless trek across the continent that broke so many before they ever reached their promised land. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to 5 months ago when you stood in Independence, Missouri, full of hope and determination, completely unprepared for the hell that awaited you on the trail. The morning of departure arrived with a deceptive beauty, May 1st, 1870, and the staging ground outside Independence buzzed with activity as dozens of families made final preparations for the journey west. You remember the excitement, the nervous energy that crackled through the air like electricity. Women checked and rechecked supply lists while men inspected wagon wheels and oxen hooves. Children ran between the wagons, their laughter mixing with the lowing of cattle and the creak of leather harnesses. Nobody spoke of the graves that already dotted the trail ahead, the thousands who'd attempted this journey and never completed it. Your wagon, a modest affair that cost you $300, nearly half your life savings, groaned under the weight of supplies. The recommended list had seemed excessive back in civilization: 2,000 pounds of flour, 400 pounds of bacon, 100 pounds of coffee, 200 pounds of lard, 150 pounds of sugar, and countless other provisions. Now, standing at the edge of the wilderness, it seemed pitifully inadequate. You learned soon enough that it was. The wagon train consisted of 37 families, about 200 souls in total, led by a guide named Josiah Hartwell, who claimed to have made the journey 8 times. His face, weathered to the texture of old boot leather, should have been warning enough. The missing fingers on his left hand, frostbite, he'd later admit, should have told you everything you needed to know about what lay ahead. But in those first days, optimism overruled common sense. The initial week lulled everyone into false confidence. The weather held fair, the trail was well marked, and the novelty of the adventure sustained spirits. Families gathered around campfires each evening, sharing meals and stories, children playing games in the fading light. You remember thinking how beautiful the prairie looked, stretching endlessly under the vast sky. You hadn't yet learned to fear that emptiness, hadn't yet understood how it could swallow people whole, without leaving a trace. Then came the first death. Little Mary Patterson, age 4, burning with fever in the back of her family's wagon. The group stopped for 2 days, hoping she'd recover. But frontier fever, probably typhoid, doesn't care about hope. You helped dig that first small grave, watched her mother collapse over the tiny mound of earth, listened to her father's broken voice reading from the Bible. The wagon train moved on the next morning because it had to. Time was everything on the trail. Winter would come, whether you were ready or not. The Pattersons were never the same after that. You'd see Mrs. Patterson walking beside their wagon, her eyes vacant, her lips moving in silent conversation with her dead daughter. 3 weeks later, she simply wandered off into the prairie during the night watch. They found her body 2 days later, 5 miles from the trail. She'd just laid down in the grass and let the exposure take her. Mr. Patterson buried his wife beside the trail, marked the spot with a pile of stones that would be scattered by the first strong wind, and kept moving west with his surviving children. What else could he do? By the time you reached the Platte River, the veneer of adventure had worn completely away. The trail followed the river for hundreds of miles. A river was a generous term for what was essentially a mile-wide stretch of muddy, alkaline water that was barely drinkable even after boiling. The joke among travelers was that the Platte was too thick to drink and too thin to plow. But jokes became fewer as the reality of trail life ground everyone down. The routine was brutal in its monotony. Wake before dawn, cold and stiff from sleeping on the ground. Breakfast was usually cold biscuits and bacon grease. If you were lucky, break camp, load the wagons, yoke the oxen, all before the sun cleared the horizon. Then walk, always walk, 15 to 20 miles a day, every day, no matter the weather or how you felt. The wagons were too heavily loaded and the trail too rough to ride except for the very young. Very old or very sick, your feet became masses of blisters that burst and bled, then formed new blisters on top of the raw flesh. Your boots, sturdy things that had cost a week's wages back home, fell apart within the first month. You wrapped your feet in rags and kept walking because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant death. The dust was omnipresent, churned up by hundreds of hooves and wheels, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that worked its way into every crevice of your body. You learned to tell position in the wagon train by the amount of dust people ate. Those in front got the clearest air, while those bringing up the rear lived in a permanent cloud of choking particles. Water became an obsession. The few good springs along the trail were separated by days of travel, and between them, you relied on whatever could be found: muddy puddles, alkaline seeps that left a white crust on everything, river water that tasted of decay, dysentery, struck with predictable regularity, the bloody flux, they called it, and it killed more travelers than Indian attacks and accidents combined. You'd see people stumbling along behind the wagons, stopping every few minutes to void their bowels, growing weaker with each passing hour, until they simply couldn't continue. The children suffered most. You watched them wither like flowers in the desert heat, their bodies unable to cope with the constant exposure, poor nutrition, and contaminated water. Whooping cough swept through the wagon train in Nebraska, the distinctive whoop of struggling breath becoming a soundtrack to your days. 7 children died in a single week, their small bodies buried in hasty graves beside the trail. Mothers would place toys or treasured possessions on the graves, knowing they'd never return to visit, knowing the graves would be lost to time, and whether within months, food became increasingly monotonous and scarce. The bacon went rancid in the heat, but you ate it anyway. The flour developed weevils, but you couldn't afford to throw it out. Fresh meat was a rare luxury. The men would hunt when possible, but ammunition was precious and game grew scarcer the further west you traveled. You learned to make trail bread, flour, water, and grease cooked over buffalo chip fires. You learned to be grateful for it, even as it sat in your stomach like a lead weight. The landscape itself became an enemy. The endless grasslands gave way to increasingly hostile terrain. River crossings were nightmares of calculation and risk. Too early in the season, and the rivers ran high with snowmelt. Too late, and you risked being caught by winter. You watched the Hendersons lose everything at the North Platte crossing. When their wagon overturned in the current, their oxen drowned, their supplies washed away, their teenage son pulled under by the weight of his clothes and never seen again. The family had to abandon what little they salvaged and throw themselves on the charity of others who had little to spare. Then came the mountains. The Rocky Mountains rose from the plains like a wall designed by God to test the limits of human endurance. The trail became a series of brutal climbs and terrifying descents. Wagons had to be unloaded and pulled up slopes by double teams of oxen while people carried supplies on their backs. Coming down was worse. Wagons chained to trees and lowered by rope, everyone holding their breath and praying the ropes would hold. The Carlisle wagon got away on Devil's Backbone, careening down the mountainside and smashing to pieces on the rocks below. Mrs. Carlisle had been inside, too sick with mountain fever to walk. They buried what they could find of her and moved on. The weather turned vicious in the mountains. Summer on the plains had been brutal enough, but the high country brought its own torments. Hailstorms struck without warning, ice balls the size of eggs battering people and animals alike. Lightning killed the men who sought shelter under a lone tree. Snow fell in July, coating everything in a wet, miserable blanket that made the trail nearly impassable. You remember huddling in your wagon, teeth chattering, wondering how you'd ever thought this journey was a good idea. Accidents multiplied as exhaustion took its toll. Wagon wheels crushed feet and legs with increasing frequency as people grew careless from fatigue. Martha Daniels fell under her family's wagon and the wheel passed over her chest. She lingered for 3 agonizing days, drowning slowly in her own blood while her family could only watch. A man named Thompson shot himself in the foot while cleaning his rifle and died of blood poisoning 2 weeks later, raving with fever as his leg turned black with gangrene. The oxen began dying in Wyoming. These patient beasts who pulled your entire life across the continent simply laid down and refused to get up. Their strength was gone, used up on the endless miles of trail. Without oxen, wagons had to be abandoned. You'd pass them every few miles, sitting beside the trail like monuments to failure, their contents scattered by previous travelers desperate for anything useful: furniture, books, treasured heirlooms, all the things people couldn't bear to leave behind at the journey's start, litter the trail like the debris of shattered dreams. Indian attacks, so prominent in the dime novels that glorified Western expansion, were actually rare, but the fear was constant. Every distant dust cloud might be a war party. Every night sound could herald disaster. When attacks did come, they were usually raids on the livestock rather than direct assaults on the wagons. While losing your oxen or horses meant you were as good as dead anyway. The Sioux took all the Brennan family's animals one night in Wyoming. The family had to abandon their wagon and walk, carrying what they could. Only 2 of the 5 Brennans made it to the next fort. Perhaps worse than the physical hardships was watching the psychological toll mount day by day. People who'd started the journey as neighbors and friends turned on each other over perceived slights and scarce resources. Fights broke out over camping spots, water rights. Whose turn it was to stand night watch? The Reverend Phillips, who'd led prayer services every evening during the first weeks, stopped speaking entirely after his wife died of childbed fever. He just walked beside his wagon, staring at nothing, while his motherless infant wheeled in the back. Women bore a particular burden on the trail, expected to maintain some semblance of domestic life while walking 15 miles a day. They cooked, cleaned, mended, and nursed the sick, all while dealing with their own exhaustion and grief. Pregnancy on the trail was a death sentence more often than not. You lost count of the graves marked mother and infant along the way. The lucky ones miscarried early. The unlucky ones went into labor miles from any help, bleeding out in the back of wagons while their families could only pray died by. The time you reached the Continental Divide, your wagon train had lost 1/3 of its members to death, disease, or desertion. Some families simply stopped, too broken to continue, settling wherever they happened to be when their strength or will gave out. Others turned back, preferring the shame of failure to the certainty of death, but most pressed on because they had no choice. They'd invested everything in this journey, not just money, but hope, identity, future. To turn back was to admit that all the suffering had been for nothing. The final push through the desert of Nevada and the Sierra Nevada mountains broke whatever spirit remained. Water holes marked on maps turned out to be dry or poisoned with alkali. The temperature swung from blazing heat during the day to near freezing at night. People began to hallucinate from dehydration and exhaustion, seeing lakes that weren't there, talking to dead relatives, wandering off into the wasteland. You tied children to wagons to keep them from straying. You melted snow for water and didn't care that it tasted of dirt and desperation. And then, finally, after 5 months of hell, you saw it, the valley that was supposed to be your promised land. But there was no celebration among the survivors. You were too tired, too damaged, too aware of all you'd lost along the way. Of the third of 7 families that had started in independence, only 23 partial families remained. The others lay in unmarked graves across the 1,000 miles of trail, their dreams buried with them in the unforgiving earth. This is what you survived to reach that frontier town where you now lie sleepless. This is the price you paid for the privilege of trying to scratch out an existence in a land that wants you dead. The journey west broke something in everyone who attempted it, left scars that would never heal, created a hardness that would define frontier life. You survived the trail, yes, but at what cost? And for what? To face a different kind of brutal existence, one where the journey's end was just the beginning of a new and perhaps even harsher struggle for survival. Now, as you lie in this vermin-infested boarding house, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the walls, you realize that surviving the journey was only the beginning. The real test comes in creating shelter in this hostile land, in building something that might protect you from nature's relentless assault. You think of tomorrow, when you'll stake your claim on a piece of prairie and attempt to create a home from nothing but dirt, desperation, and whatever materials you can scavenge. The very thought fills you with a dread that settles deep in your bones. Morning comes too soon, and with it, the harsh reality of what homesteading actually means. You've claimed your 160 acres under the Homestead Act, free land, they said, as if anything in this life were truly free. The cost becomes apparent as you stand on your property for the first time, seeing nothing but endless grassland broken only by a small creek that may or may not run dry come summer. No trees for lumber, no stones for building, just grass, sky, and the overwhelming realization that you must create shelter from essentially nothing. The first settlers in this area lived in their wagons for months, but winter is coming, and a wagon offers about as much protection from a Great Plains blizzard as a paper parasol. You've heard the stories. Families found frozen to death in their wagons, huddled together in a final, futile attempt to share warmth. Children with blackened fingers and toes from frostbite. Amputations performed with farming tools and whiskey for anesthetic. No, you need something more substantial, and you need it fast. Like most homesteaders, you'll start with a dugout, a cave carved into a hillside or a hole dug into the ground. It's the most primitive shelter imaginable, but it's what you can manage with the tools at hand. You choose a spot on a slight rise, hoping to avoid the worst of the spring flooding, and begin to dig. The work is backbreaking. The prairie soil, baked hard by the summer sun, resists every strike of your shovel. Your hands, already raw from the journey, develop new blisters that burst and bleed, but you keep digging because the alternative is death. It takes 2 weeks of constant labor to excavate a space roughly 12 feet by 14 feet, smaller than the bedroom you had back east, but it will have to shelter your entire family. The walls are bare earth, already beginning to crumble in places. You shore them up with what little scrap wood you can find, but you know it's a temporary solution at best. The ceiling is your greatest concern. Without proper support, it could collapse and bury you alive. You've heard of entire families found that way come spring, entombed in their own homes for the roof. You lay cottonwood poles across the top, greenwood that will warp and crack as it dries. But it's all that's available. Over this, you place layers of brush, then grass, then a thick coating of mud that you pray will keep out the rain. It doesn't. The first storm reveals every weakness in your construction. Water streams through gaps, turning your floor into a mud hole. The mud walls begin to slump. You spend the night pressing rags into leaks and bailing water with cooking pots, all while your children huddle on the one dry corner of bedding. The smell inside a dugout is something that defies description. It's the smell of damp earth that never dries, of mold and mildew that bloom in the corners, of human bodies without proper washing facilities, of chamber pots that can't be emptied during blizzards. It's the smell of mice nesting in the walls, of the snakes that come to hunt the mice, of the endless battle against decay and decomposition. You try burning sage and cedar when you can find it, but the smoke just adds another layer to the assault on your senses. Ventilation is nearly impossible. One small window, if you're lucky enough to have glass, which costs more than a month's supplies, and whatever air seeps through the door. In winter, you seal every crack to keep out the cold, which means breathing the same fetid air for months. Tuberculosis spreads like wildfire in these conditions. You hear the telltale cough starting in your eldest child and feel your heart sink. There's no doctor for 100 miles, no medicine but what herbs you might have brought. No hope but prayer and a slim chance that young lungs might fight off what kills so many. But a dugout, miserable as it is still better than the alternative. Those who can't even manage that much resort to sod houses, soddies in the local parlance. You watch your neighbors, the Johnsons, build theirs. It's a fascinating and horrifying process. First, they cut blocks of prairie sod, each 1 to feet long, 1 foot wide, and 4 inches thick. The prairie grass has roots that go down 8 feet or more, creating a dense mat that holds together like a brick. In theory, in practice, sod. Construction is an exercise in frustration and failure. The blocks must be laid grass side down, staggered like bricks, but they shift and settle unpredictably. Walls bow outward or inward. Corners refuse to stay square. The Johnsons rebuild their north wall 3 times before it stays upright. Even then, you can see daylight through gaps that will let in wind, rain, and every crawling creature on the prairie. The sod house, once complete, is its own special kind of hell. The walls are alive. Literally, insects make their homes in the sod blocks. Centipedes drop from the ceiling onto sleeping children. Fleas breed in the millions, turning rest into a torture of constant itching and scratching. You visit Mrs. Johnson and find her children's bodies covered in red welts, some infected and oozing pus. She's tried everything. Boiling water poured into the walls, smoke from burning sulfur, even kerosene rubbed into the worst areas. Nothing works. The bugs always come back. Snakes are perhaps the worst torment. Bull snakes, blue racers, and prairie rattlers all find sod houses irresistible. They slide between the sod blocks, hunting the mice and insects. Coiling in the dark corners where children play. The Petersons lost their 2-year-old daughter to a rattlesnake bite. She was playing on the floor while her mother cooked dinner, reached under a shelf for her doll, and disturbed a rattler that had taken up residence. The child died in agony 12 hours later, her body swollen and discolored, while her parents could do nothing but watch. Weather turns these primitive shelters into torture chambers. Summer temperatures on the plains can reach 110 degrees, and a sod house becomes an oven. The thick walls that might seem like insulation actually trap heat, creating an interior that's even hotter than outside. Families sleep outdoors when they can, but that brings its own dangers: wolves, coyotes, and the human predators who roam the frontier looking for easy victims. So most endure the suffocating heat indoors, lying in pools of their own sweat, praying for a breeze that never comes. But summer is paradise compared to winter. The first blizzard teaches you what true cold means. It starts with a wall of white that appears on the horizon, moving faster than a horse can run. The temperature drops 40 degrees in an hour. Wind screams across the prairie at 16 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally, creating drifts that can bury a house overnight. You've strung rope between your dugout and the privy, and you need it. Visibility drops to 0, and people have frozen to death 20 feet from their own doors. Lost in the white void, inside your dugout, ice forms on the walls despite the fire you're burning. Your water bucket freezes solid. The children sleep in all their clothes, huddled together like puppies, and still wake crying from the cold. You burn anything that will catch fire: dry grass, buffalo chips, precious furniture brought from back east. The smoke fills the tiny space until everyone's eyes stream tears. But it's better than freezing. You ration food carefully because you don't know how long the storm will last. 3 days, a week. Some blizzards keep families trapped for 2 weeks or more. The psychological toll of these shelters cannot be overstated. Women, especially, suffer from what they call prairie madness, months of confinement in a dark, dirty hole in the ground, with no company but crying children and the endless wind. Breaks minds as surely as any torture. Mrs. Olson started talking to people who weren't there. Mrs. Schmidt was found walking naked in a blizzard, laughing and calling for her mother. Some women simply stopped talking altogether, going about their daily tasks in eerie silence until their families wake to find them dead by their own hand. Men aren't immune either. The pressure of providing shelter that's barely adequate, of watching their families suffer in conditions they never allow animals to endure, drives many to drink, violence, or desertion. You hear of homesteaders who simply walk away one day, leaving their families to fend for themselves. Others take more violent exits. The Garrett place sits empty now, after Mr. Garrett killed his wife and children before turning the gun on himself. The note he left said only, "Better dead than this living hell. Spring brings its own torments." The frost leaves the ground, and dugout walls that stayed firm when frozen turn to mud. Roofs sag and leak. The spring rains find every weakness in your construction. And what was miserable but bearable in winter becomes an aquatic nightmare. Everything molds, bedding, clothes, food stores. Respiratory infections run rampant. You wake coughing, your lungs full of fluid, wondering if this will be the illness that finally takes you. Those fortunate enough to survive the first year might attempt to build something better. A real house, made of lumber brought in by rail at crushing expense. But even these proper houses are a far cry from what anyone would call adequate shelter. The lumber is green and warps as it dries, creating gaps that let in wind and weather. There's no insulation except what newspapers you can stuff into the walls. Single-pane windows, if you can afford glass at all, do almost nothing to keep out the cold. In winter, frost forms on the inside of windows an inch thick. The constant repairs never end. Wind tears off shingles. Hail smashes windows. The house shifts and settles on the unstable prairie soil, causing doors that won't close and floors that slope at crazy angles. Every storm brings new damage, and materials for repair cost money you don't have, so you make do with whatever's at hand. Tin cans hammered flat to patch holes, rags stuffed into cracks, prayers that the whole structure doesn't collapse in the next windstorm. This is the reality of shelter on the frontier, not the cozy log cabins of imagination, but desperate struggles against nature with inadequate materials and tools. Every day is a battle to maintain even the most basic protection from elements that seem determined to reclaim this land from human intrusion. You survive not because your shelter is adequate, but because the human body can endure more than seems possible. You adapt to misery, normalize suffering, and call mere survival a victory. And always, there's the knowledge that nature is just warming up. That dugout or soddy that barely kept you alive through one winter must do it again and again, until you either build something better, give up and leave, or join the countless others who lie in frontier graves, defeated by the brutal indifference of the plains. This is what home means in the Wild West. Not a refuge from the storm, but merely the place where you wage your daily battle against the forces trying to kill you, hoping that today won't be the day you finally lose. As you huddle in your primitive shelter, listening to your stomach growl with a deep, gnawing emptiness that has become your constant companion, you realize that having a roof over your head, however inadequate, means nothing if you starve to death beneath it. The romantic notion of living off the land, of amber waves of grain and successful harvests, collides with the brutal reality of frontier agriculture. Here, on the unforgiving plains, starvation isn't just a possibility, it's a probability that stalks every homesteader. With the patience of a prairie wolf, you came here with seeds and dreams, convinced that 160 acres of free land would yield abundance. The railroad pamphlets showed drawings of wheat fields so thick you could barely walk through them, corn stalks reaching toward heaven, vegetables growing to enormous size in the fertile prairie soil. What they didn't show was the truth, that this soil, never broken by plow, would fight you every inch of the way, that the weather would destroy your crops with biblical efficiency, that even if you managed to grow something, storing and preserving it through winter would be its own special nightmare. Your first attempt at breaking the prairie teaches you humility quickly. The native grasses have roots that go down 8, 10, 12 feet, forming a mass so dense your plow bounces off it like iron hitting stone. You've brought what you thought was a good plow from back east, but it's designed for soil that's been worked for generations. Here, it's useless. You need a special prairie breaker plow that costs more than you have. So you make do with what you've got, fighting for every furrow. It takes you 3 weeks to break 5 acres. Your hands are masses of blisters despite the thick gloves. Your shoulders and back scream with every movement. The oxen, if you still have them after the journey, are exhausted, their strength depleted by poor feed and constant work. You watch them stumble and strain, knowing that if they die, you're finished. No oxen means no plowing means no crops means starvation. It's a simple equation with a deadly solution. Even when you manage to break the ground, planting is an act of faith, bordering on delusion. You carefully place your precious seeds, wheat, corn, maybe some vegetables if you're optimistic, into the furrows, covering them with soil that's already dry and dusty. You have no irrigation, no way to water beyond what rain might come. You're entirely at the mercy of weather patterns you don't understand in a climate that swings between extremes with casual cruelty. The first crop failure comes as a shock despite all the warnings. You watch your wheat sprout, tiny green shoots that represent hope and survival. only to see them shrivel and die in the heat of June. No rain for 6 weeks. The ground bakes hard as concrete. You try carrying water from the creek, but it's like trying to fill the ocean with a teaspoon. The plants die anyway, leaving you with 5 acres of dust and the terrible knowledge that you've wasted seeds you can't replace. Those who manage to get crops started face other torments. Grasshoppers arrive in clouds so thick they darken the sun. You hear them coming, a sound like distant thunder that grows louder until it's a roar that fills the world. They descend on fields like a biblical plague, eating everything green down to the ground in hours. You try to fight them with fire, with smoke, with blankets and noise. Nothing works. They eat the crops that start on anything made of wood, tool handles, fence posts, even the walls of your house if they're unpainted. Mrs. Lindstrom tells you about the grasshopper plague of 74, her voice hollow with remembered horror. They ate everything, not just the crops, but clothes on the line, curtains and windows, leather harnesses hanging in barns. They filled wells and streams with their bodies until the water was undrinkable. Children who went outside came back covered in them, screaming as the insects tangled in their hair and crawled down their clothes. When the grasshoppers finally left, after 3 days of devastation, there was nothing left but bare earth and the sound of women crying. Even successful crops faced the challenge of harvest and storage. Your scythe, dulled by cutting prairie grass, struggles with wheat stalks hardened by sun and wind. Every swing hurts your already damaged body. You work, from dawn to dusk, racing against time, because hail could come any day and destroy everything in minutes. You've seen fields ready for harvest turned to mud and pulped by hailstones the size of hen's eggs. A whole year's work destroyed in 10 minutes of natural violence. If you manage to harvest anything, storage becomes the next battle. You have no proper granary, no way to keep grain dry and safe from rodents. Mice and rats multiply beyond belief, growing fat on grain you can't protect. You try storing wheat in the dugout, but moisture leads to mold that makes it inedible. You lose a third of your harvest to spoilage, another third to vermin. What's left might get your family through winter if you ration carefully. And nothing goes wrong. Something always goes wrong. The diet of a frontier family reveals the true meaning of monotony. Cornmeal mush for breakfast. Every breakfast, for months on end. The children stop complaining after a while, not because they've accepted it, but because they've learned complaint is useless. Lunch might be cold cornbread if you're lucky, nothing if you're not. Dinner is the big meal, more cornmeal, maybe with some salt pork if any remains from the journey. The salt pork, purchased months ago, has turned rancid in the heat, the fat, yellow and reeking, but you eat it anyway because fat is calories and calories mean survival. Vegetables are almost impossible to grow. The wind desiccates tender plants. What survives the wind falls to insects, drought, or flood. You try growing potatoes, the frontier staple, but the yield is pitiful, small, scabby things that taste of dirt and disappointment. You remember fresh vegetables from back east, like a dream of paradise. Scurvy becomes common, children's teeth loosening in their gums, strange bruises appearing on skin stretched tight over bones. Hunting seems like the answer until you try it. The buffalo that once blackened the plains are gone, slaughtered by professional hunters for their hides. Deer and antelope exist, but are wary and scarce. Ammunition costs money you don't have, and every missed shot represents food your children won't eat. You learn to trap rabbits and prairie dogs, stringy creatures that provide more bone than meat. You learn to be grateful for anything that adds protein to the pot, including things that would have disgusted you in your former life. The Hendersons tried eating prairie dogs exclusively one winter. When their crops failed completely, by spring, the entire family was sick with something the local doctor, when one finally arrived, couldn't identify. Turned out the prairie dogs in that area fed on selenium-rich plants, and the poison had built up in the family's bodies. 2 of their children died, their hair falling out, their nails turning black, their minds going before their bodies finally gave up. The survivors were marked for life, tremors, weakness, minds that never quite worked right again. Water quality affects everything you try to grow or cook. The alkaline water from your well leaves white residue on everything, gives food a bitter taste that never goes away. It causes chronic digestive problems that weaken already malnourished bodies. You boil it, strain it, add vinegar when you have it, but nothing really helps. The children develop chronic diarrhea that further depletes their strength. You watch them grow thinner despite your efforts, their eyes to large and gaunt faces. Winter transforms hunger into starvation. Your meager stores dwindle day by day. You cut rations, then cut them again. One meal a day becomes the norm. The children stop playing, conserving energy they don't have. You catch yourself staring at the remaining food stores, calculating days versus supplies, knowing the math doesn't work, but unable to make it come out differently. The weakest succumb first. The elderly, the very young, those already compromised by illness or injury. The Olsons lost their baby that first winter. Little Eric, barely a year old, simply faded away despite his mother giving him the largest portions. His cries grew weaker, then stopped altogether. He died quietly in his sleep, his body consuming itself when no food remained. They couldn't bury him. The ground was frozen solid, so they wrapped his tiny corpse in what cloth they could spare and placed it in a lean-to where it froze solid. Come spring, when they finally put him in the ground, he weighed less than a newborn. Desperate times lead to desperate measures. Families trade everything of value for food. Wedding rings, family Bibles, heirloom furniture brought at great cost from back east, all exchanged for a few pounds of flour or cornmeal at prices that amount to robbery. The general store owner grows fat while his customers waste away. But what choice do they have? Pride becomes a luxury no one can afford when children cry from hunger. Some turn to eating things that shouldn't be food. Boiled leather provides some nutrition. People cut up old shoes and belts, boiling them for hours to create a glutinous soup that tastes of despair. Tree bark, ground into powder, can extend flour supplies. Weeds that cattle won't touch get added to stews. You learn which plants will kill you quickly and which ones will just make you sick. Being sick is better than being dead, so you take your chances. The psychological effects of chronic hunger compound the physical misery. Starvation changes people, strips away civilization's veneer to reveal the animal beneath. You see neighbors who shared meals in better times now guarding their stores with rifles. Theft becomes common, a sack of grain disappearing in the night, a chicken vanishing from its coop. Trust erodes as surely as bodies waste away. Community gatherings stop because no one can spare the energy, and everyone resents those who appear better fed. Children bear special scars from frontier hunger. Those who survive grow up hoarding food, unable to feel secure no matter how much they have. They learn to eat quickly, furtively, afraid someone will take their portion. They develop what doctors back east call frontier syndrome, an inability to leave food on a plate, a compulsion to hide food against future famine. Nightmares about starvation that persist into adulthood. The psychological damage outlasts the physical recovery by decades. Spring brings fresh torments disguised as hope. The stored food is gone, or nearly so, but new crops won't yield for months. This is the starving time, when bodies weakened by winter must somehow find strength to break ground and plant again. People gnaw on seed grain, knowing they're eating their future, but unable to resist the present hunger. Wild plants provide some relief. Dandelion greens, wild onions, various weeds, but these require knowledge many don't have. The cemetery gains new residents who poison themselves trying to fill empty bellies with the wrong plants. Even when crops succeed, the cycle of feast and famine never really ends. One good harvest might be followed by 3 failures. Prices for what little you can buy fluctuate wildly. The railroad that was supposed to bring prosperity instead brings price manipulation. That ensures farmers remain poor no matter how hard they work. You grow corn that you can't afford to eat because you need to sell it to buy essentials. You raise chickens but can't spare the eggs. Every calorie becomes a calculation in an equation where the numbers never add up to enough. This is the starvation reality of frontier life, not dramatic famine that kills quickly, but the slow grind of never quite enough. Bodies adapt to chronic malnutrition, becoming smaller, weaker, more susceptible to disease. Minds dulled by hunger make poor decisions that perpetuate the cycle. Children grow up stunted, their potential forever limited by crucial nutrients. Denied during development, survival becomes not a question of thriving, but of lasting one more day, one more season, one more year in the hope that somehow, someday, things will improve. But for many, that day never comes. The frontier graves filled with the starved out number, those killed by violence 10 to 1. They died quietly, without drama, their bodies simply giving up when nothing remained to sustain them. They died believing in the promise of the West, holding on to hope until their weakened fingers could no longer grasp even that. And you, lying in your dugout listening to your children's restless hunger, wonder if your name will join theirs, carved on a wooden marker that will weather away. to nothing, leaving no trace of your struggle except the bones beneath the prairie grass. The thirst hits you even in your dreams now. A constant companion more faithful than any human could be. You wake with your tongue swollen, lips cracked and bleeding, throat so dry that swallowing feels like grinding sand. In the darkness of your dugout, you can hear your children whimpering in their sleep, their bodies crying out for water even in unconsciousness. You reach for the water bucket, knowing before your fingers touch it that it's nearly empty. Again, always again. Because here on the frontier, water isn't just life, it's the difference between a slow death and a quick one at most days. You're not sure which would be more merciful when you first arrived. The land agent assured you there was water on your claim, a nice little creek, he said, marking it on the map with confidence. What he didn't mention was that the creek ran dry from June to September, that the nice little flow turned into a raging torrent during spring floods, or that the water, when it did run, carried enough alkali to poison livestock. You learned these truths the hard way, like everything else out here. Your first attempt at finding water comes back to you now like a fever dream. You hired a water witch, a grizzled old man who claimed his forked willow branch could locate underground streams. You paid him $5 precious to walk your land, following behind as he muttered and swayed, the branch supposedly pulling toward hidden water. He marked 3 spots. You dug them all, backbreaking work in the hard prairie soil, going down 10, 15, 20 feet, nothing but dry earth and shattered hopes. The well you finally managed to dig, 35 feet deep, hand dug over 3 weeks of brutal labor, produces water that would make a dog turn away. It's bitter with alkali, leaves a white crust on everything it touches, and causes violent intestinal distress in those not accustomed to it. But it's water, of a sort. And out here you learn to be grateful for whatever you can get. You boil it, let it settle, skim off what minerals you can, and pretend the taste doesn't make you gag. The real education comes during your first drought. It starts subtly, a few weeks without rain that doesn't seem unusual. Then a month passes. Then 2. The grass turns brown and crunches underfoot. The creek bed becomes a snake of cracked mud. Your well drops lower each day until you're lowering the bucket on every inch of rope you own, and still barely getting it wet. That's when you understand why the old-timers looked at water the way city folks look at. Gold.water rights out here are worth killing for, and people do. The Johnsons and the Millers had been neighbors for 2 years, helping each other through the worst of times. Then the drought of 70 to hit, and both families depended on the same spring. The argument started. Small. Whose cattle could drink when? How much each family could take for household use? By August, when the spring had dwindled to a trickle, both men were carrying guns. The confrontation was inevitable. Miller shot Johnson over a bucket of water that wouldn't have kept a chicken alive for a week. Now, Johnson's widow and children beg water from neighbors who have none to spare, while Miller awaits trial in a town where no jury will convict a man for protecting his water rights. You learn the hierarchy of water use quickly. First priority goes to drinking water for humans, though drinking becomes a relative term when the water tastes like it's been filtered through a salt lick. Next comes water for cooking, though you learn to use the same water multiple times. First for washing vegetables when you have them, then for cooking, finally for washing dishes. The grease and food particles are tomorrow's problem. Today's problem is having any water at all. Livestock come last, and watching your animals suffer tears at your soul. Cattle bawl constantly, their tongues swollen, eyes sunken. Horses stand, with heads low, too weak to swat at the flies that torment them. Chickens pant in whatever shade they can find, their egg production dropping to nothing. You've seen desperate cattle break through fences to reach water, only to drink themselves to death when they finally find it. Their bodies bloat and split in the heat, adding contamination to whatever water source they die beside. Washing becomes a luxury you can't afford. You forget what it feels like to be truly clean. Your skin develops a grayish cast from accumulated dirt and sweat. Clothes stand stiff with dried perspiration and grime. You wash faces and hands when you can, but full baths are a memory from another life. The children develop sores that won't heal, infections that spread in the dirty conditions. Lice and fleas multiply in the filth, but killing them requires water you don't have. The search for new water sources becomes an obsession. Men spend days away from their families, ranging farther and farther with empty barrels, hoping to find a spring or stream others haven't discovered. Some never return, whether from accident, attack, or simply choosing to keep going rather than return empty-handed, to watch their families die of thirst. You find their bones sometimes, bleached white beside dry creek beds, their last desperate, dig for water marked by broken fingernails in the hard earth. Those lucky enough to find water face the challenge of transporting it. A barrel of water weighs over 400 pounds. On rough prairie tracks, half of it sloshes out before you get home. What arrives is muddy from the constant agitation, sometimes polluted with dead animals you didn't notice upstream, but you drink it anyway. Strain it through cloth that's none to clean itself, boil it when you have fuel, and pray it won't kill you faster than thirst would. Rain, when it comes, drives people mad with relief and desperation. You see grown men standing in the downpour with their mouths open, weeping as they drink from the sky. Every container is pressed into service, pots, pans, buckets, wash tubs, anything that will hold water. You spray canvas to catch runoff, dig hasty catch basins, trying to capture every drop. Children strip naked and dance in the rain, their skinny bodies shining as they experience the forgotten luxury of water touching their skin. But rain on the frontier follows no gentle pattern. It comes in violent storms that dump inches in minutes, water running off the baked ground too fast to soak in. Flash floods roar through dry creek beds, sweeping away anyone foolish enough to be caught there. The same families dying of thirst one week can be drowning the next. You've seen entire homesteads washed away, months of labor vanishing in muddy torrents that leave behind nothing but debris and despair. Winter brings its own water challenges. Your well freezes solid, requiring you to build fires to thaw the pump if you have fuel to spare. Snow seems like salvation until you realize how little water it actually contains. It takes buckets and buckets of snow to melt down to one bucket of water, and the labor of gathering it in blizzard conditions claims its own toll. You chip ice from frozen streams, hauling it home to melt, the cold burning your already damaged. Hence, the alkaline water creates its own special torments. It causes chronic diarrhea that further dehydrates already parched bodies. Children develop kidney stones, screaming in agony as they try to pass them. Pregnant women miscarry, their bodies unable to support new life when poisoned by the very water they need to survive. You boil dried herbs when you can find them, trying to mask the taste and counteract the minerals. But it's like trying to bandage a severed limb. Disease spreads through contaminated water with terrifying efficiency. Cholera arrives in summer, turning strong adults into corpses within days. The victim's body pours out fluids it can't spare, dying of dehydration while surrounded by the very water that killed them. Typhoid fever burns through families who share the same water source. You watch neighbors you've known for years waste away, knowing your family drinks from the same well, wondering when your turn will come. The social dynamics around water reveal humanity at its worst, and occasionally its best. Water hoarding becomes common, families hiding whatever reserves they have, lying about their wells going dry to avoid sharing. But you also see acts of kindness, a widow sharing her last barrel with neighbors' children, men risking their lives to dig community wells that might benefit everyone. These moments of grace shine brighter for their rarity. Children adapt to the water scarcity in heartbreaking ways. They learn not to ask for drinks, to ignore their thirst until it becomes unbearable. They play games that don't require running in the heat, conserving moisture their bodies can't spare. You see them sucking on pebbles to generate saliva, chewing grass for whatever moisture it might contain. Their growth stunts, their development slows, their bodies adapting to chronic dehydration in ways that will affect them for life. The psychological toll of water scarcity compounds daily. The constant calculation, is this worth the water? Can we go another day without washing? Should we drink now or save it for later? Exhausts minds already stressed by survival. People make increasingly poor decisions as dehydration affects their judgment. Fights break out over puddles. Neighbors who once helped each other become suspicious strangers guarding their wells with shotguns. Some develop what the doctors call water madness, an obsession with water that dominates every waking thought. They dig well after well, convinced water lies just a few feet deeper. They perform elaborate rain dances learned from Indians or invented from desperation. They see mirages of lakes and rivers, leading their families on delusional journeys toward water that exists only in their fevered minds. The asylum in the state capital has a whole ward for frontier people broken by thirst. Even when water is available, its quality varies so wildly that using it becomes a gamble. Sulfur springs that smell like rotten eggs but won't kill you. Iron heavy. Water that stains everything orange and tastes like blood. Water so laden with minerals it leaves crystals in your cooking pots. You learn to rank water not by clarity or taste, but by how sick it makes you. Mild intestinal distress becomes acceptable. Anything that doesn't cause immediate vomiting is considered good. The technology to improve water situations exists, but remains out of reach for most homesteaders. Windmills that could pump water from deeper wells cost more than a year's income. Ceramic filters that might remove some contaminants are luxuries few can afford. So you make do with cheesecloth and sand, with boiling when you have fuel, with hope and prayer when you have nothing else. This is water on the frontier, not the clear, abundant streams of imagination, but a scarce resource contaminated with alkali, disease, and desperation. Every drop becomes precious beyond measure. People die reaching for it, kill to protect it, go mad from the lack of it. You measure your life not in years but in gallons, knowing that when the water runs out, so does hope, and still you endure, because the alternative is to join the countless others who gave up, dried out, and blew away like dust on the prairie wind, leaving nothing behind but the wells they dug in vain. The fever starts at sundown, just as you're finishing the endless daily chores. Your youngest complains of a headache, nothing unusual in this land of constant hardship. But by midnight, she's burning like a coal, delirious, calling for people. Who aren't there? You place a precious wet cloth on her forehead, knowing it's as useful as trying to cool a wildfire with spit. The nearest doctor is in Dodge City, 3 days away by wagon in good weather. It's December, a blizzard is building, and even if you could make the journey, you don't have the $40 he'd charge just to look at her. So you do what frontier parents do. You pray, you guess, you watch your child slip away, one labored breath at a time. Medicine on the frontier is a grotesque joke played on desperate people. Back east, you at least had access to doctors who'd attended medical school, even if their methods were sometimes questionable. Here, anyone who can read a medical book, or claims to have read one, hangs out a shingle. The doctor who occasionally passes through your area is a former barber who learned his trade pulling teeth and lancing boils. His medical bag contains laudanum, calomel, a rusty saw for amputations, and little else. His favorite prescription for everything from childbirth pain to gunshot wounds is whiskey and rest, which might be sound advice if anyone had either. The isolation means that injuries and illnesses that would be minor inconveniences in civilization become death sentences. Here, a broken bone sets wrong because no one knows how to properly splint it, leaving the victim crippled for life. A cut from a rusty nail leads to tetanus, lockjaw, they call it. You watch your neighbor's son die in agony, his body arched like a bow, jaws clenched so tight his teeth shatter. You've seen a woman die from a tooth abscess that spread to her brain, her final days spent screaming in pain that no amount of laudanum could touch. Childhood diseases sweep through frontier communities like wildfire through dry grass. Scarlet fever arrives with the spring, turning children's skin bright red before it kills them. Whooping cough, that distinctive barking sound that makes parents' blood run cold, can last for months, children coughing until blood vessels burst in their eyes, until ribs crack from the force. Diphtheria coats throats with gray membrane that slowly strangles its victims. You watch them fight for every breath, their lips turning blue, their eyes pleading for help you can't give. The remedies people try border on torture. For croup, they recommend goose grease mixed with turpentine rubbed on the chest, the fumes alone enough. To make healthy people sick, for pneumonia, they suggest bleeding the patient, removing bad blood from bodies that need every drop, mustard plaster so hot that blisters skin, doses of mercury that cause teeth to fall out, teas brewed from plants that might cure or might kill. It's all guesswork performed on people who have no other options. Mrs. Henderson tells you about trying to save her baby from summer complaint. What you'd later learn was cholera infantum. She tried everything the Warren Medical Guide recommended, doses of calomel that turned the child's gums black, enemas of oak bark tea, applications of hot bricks to the stomach. Nothing worked. The baby died anyway, dehydrated and poisoned by both disease and cure. She keeps the medical book still, its pages stained with tears and the fingerprints of desperation. Childbirth becomes Russian roulette played with women's lives. 1 in 8 women die in childbirth on the frontier, and those are the lucky ones who die quickly. Others linger for days with childbed fever, their bodies rotting from the inside out while their newborns wail for milk that will never come. The midwives are usually just women who've given birth themselves and survived, passing on a mixture of folklore, superstition, and occasionally useful knowledge. You attend the birth at the Olsen place, helping because women help each other. Out here, it's that or die alone. The labor goes on for 30 hours. Mrs. Olsen tears badly, blood pooling beneath her faster than you can soak it up with rags. There's no way to stitch her properly, no clean instruments, no knowledge of what vessels might be damaged. You pack the wow with spider webs, an old remedy that sometimes helps blood clot, and pray she survives. But infection sets in within days. The smell of rotting flesh fills the sadi. She dies 3 weeks later, leaving 5 children and a husband who looks at the baby with eyes full of guilt and rage. The lack of basic hygiene makes everything worse. Surgeries, when they must be done, happen on kitchen tables scrubbed with lye if you're lucky, covered in dirty sheets if you're not. The same knife used to castrate pigs might be used to lance an abscess. Bandages get reused until they fall apart, washed in water that's barely cleaner than the wounds they cover. You've seen amputations performed with carpenter saws. The patient held down by neighbors while whiskey serves as the only anesthetic. Infections kill more people than the original injuries. A puncture wound from stepping on a nail progresses to blood poisoning, red streaks racing up the leg like lines on a map to death. Gangrene turns living flesh black and stinking, requiring amputation to save the life if you can find someone willing to try. If the patient survives the shock, if infection doesn't set in afterward, usually they die anyway, but slower and in more agony than if you'd let nature take its course. The patent medicines that traveling salesmen hawk provide false hope at premium prices. Dr. Billington's miracle tonic claims to cure everything from consumption to female complaints, but it's mostly alcohol mixed with opium and colored water. People spend their last cents on these promises in bottles, desperate for anything that might help. Sometimes the high alcohol content makes them feel temporarily better, reinforcing the delusion that the medicine works until it's too late for real treatment. Not that real treatment exists anyway. Mental illness receives even less understanding or compassion. Prairie madness, they call it when women break under the strain of isolation and loss. But there's no treatment except restraint when they become violent. Men drink themselves into oblivion to escape memories of children buried, wives lost in childbirth, dreams ground to dust. Suicide is common but hidden. Families claiming accident or illness rather than admit their loved one chose death. Over this existence, the frontier treats pregnancy like a disease that might be fatal, which it often is. Women try to hide their condition as long as possible, working until the moment labor starts because there's no one else to do the chores. Miscarriages happen in the fields. Women bleeding into the soil they're trying to cultivate, hitting up, and continuing to work because the alternative is starvation. Those who carry to term face deliveries without help, sometimes completely alone if their husbands are away and neighbors too distant. You remember finding Mrs. Schmidt after she'd given birth alone. In her sadi, her husband had gone to town for supplies, expected back in 2 days. The baby came early. She'd managed to deliver the child herself, cut the cord with sewing scissors. But the afterbirth wouldn't come. She bled to death reaching for her newborn, her last act wrapping the baby in her apron. When Schmidt returned, he found his wife dead and his son alive, crying in the cold arms of his mother. Children who survive infancy face constant threats. Accidents claim as many as disease, falls from horses, burns from cooked fires, drownings. In wells or creeks, you've seen a toddler die from eating lye left within reach, screaming as it burned through his throat and stomach. Another choked on a button from his mother's sewing basket. A girl was kicked in the head by a mule and lingered for days, unconscious, while her family could only watch and wait. The psychological trauma of constant death warps entire communities. Children grow up attending more funerals than birthdays. They learn to dig graves before they learn to read. Become experts at building coffins from whatever wood can be spared. Death becomes so common it loses its sting. Or maybe people just learn to hide their grief, knowing that showing weakness invites more loss. Epidemics arrive with seasonal regularity. Smallpox decimates entire settlements, leaving survivors scarred and often blind. Measles might take every child under 5 in a community within weeks. Influenza sweeps through in winter, when people huddle together for warmth, spreading from family to family until entire towns lie silent. There's no quarantine possible when isolation means death from cold or starvation. So diseases spread unchecked. The home remedies passed down through generations become increasingly desperate. Cow dung poultices for infections, urine washes for skin conditions, gunpowder mixed with whiskey for snake bites. Some treatments undoubtedly hasten death, but people try them anyway because doing something, anything, feels better than watching loved ones die while standing helplessly by. Even minor injuries become life-threatening without proper treatment. A splinter festers into blood poisoning. A broken tooth abscesses into fatal infection. Women develop fistulas from childbirth tears that never heal properly. Living in constant pain and humiliation, men rupture themselves doing heavy labor and spend their remaining years partially disabled, unable to work properly, but unable to stop trying. The cruel irony is that many deaths could be prevented with basic medical knowledge and supplies. Clean water for washing wounds, proper nutrition to help bodies heal, rest instead of constant labor. But these simple things remain as far out of reach as advanced surgery. The frontier demands everything and provides nothing, least of all mercy for the sick and injured. This is medical care in the Wild West, a combination of ignorance, desperation, and folk remedies that kill as often as they cure. Death stalks every household, takes children before parents learn their personalities, removes mothers and leaves orphans to raise themselves. The graveyards grow faster than the towns, and still people keep coming, believing somehow they'll be different. They'll be luckier. They'll survive where so many others haven't. But the frontier doesn't care about hope or determination. It only cares about endurance. And even that often isn't enough when injury or illness strikes and there's no help for 100 miles in any direction. The silence is what gets to you first. Not peaceful quiet, but a suffocating absence of human sound that presses against your ears until you'd welcome any noise, even screaming, just to break it. You've been alone in your soddy for 6 weeks. Now, while your husband searches for work in town, and the only voices you've heard are your own and the children's. But even they've grown quiet lately, as if the prairie has stolen their words too. You catch yourself talking to the chickens, the stove, the walls themselves, just to hear something that sounds like conversation. When you realize you've started answering yourself in different voices, the cold finger of madness traces down your spine. The vastness of the prairie creates a particular kind of insanity. Back east, even in rural areas, you could walk to a neighbor's house in an hour or two. Here, your nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away, a full day's journey. If you're lucky enough to have a horse, impossible. If you don't, the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, broken only by your pathetic soddy squatting like a scab on the face of eternity. The sameness of it drills into your brain. Grass and sky, sky and grass, with nothing to mark one day from another except the slow arc of the sun. Women suffer the isolation most acutely. Men at least have reasons to travel, taking grain to market, buying supplies, searching for work. But women remain anchored to their homesteads by children, chores, and the iron chains of frontier propriety that say a woman alone on the prairie invites trouble. So they stay, day after day, month after month, seeing no adult face except their husbands, hearing no news of the outside world, slowly forgetting that a world beyond the horizon even exists. Mrs. Powelson was one of the first to break. Educated, woman from Chicago, she'd come west with her husband full of romantic notions about frontier life. The reality, a dirt house, backbreaking labor, and months without seeing another woman, shattered her mind like glass. Her husband found her one day standing naked in a blizzard, calmly discussing philosophy with someone who wasn't there. She said the angels had come to take her to a dinner party, and she needed to get ready. Her feet were so frostbitten they had to amputate both of them. She spent her remaining years in bed, hosting elaborate tea parties for invisible guests. Her mind permanently relocated to a more bearable reality. The children who grow up in this isolation develop strange behaviors that would horrify people in civilized places. They create elaborate fantasy worlds populated by imaginary friends who become more real than distant relatives they've never met. Some stop speaking entirely, communicating only in gestures and grunts. Others develop their own languages, twin speak, between siblings that no adult can understand. You watch your own children playing their quiet games and wonder what damage this solitude is carving into their developing minds. The wind becomes a living thing when you're alone along. It never stops on the prairie, a constant howling that sounds like voices if you listen to hard. Women report hearing their dead children calling, their mothers singing lullabies, their names whispered just at the edge of perception. The wind drives people mad, its incessant noise preventing sleep, masking real sound so you're never sure if that's a wolf howling or just another trick of moving air. In winter, It screams through gaps in the walls like the tortured souls of everyone who died trying to tame. This land. Letters from home become precious beyond gold. Read and reread until the paper falls apart. But they also bring a special torture, describing a world that continues without you, births, deaths, marriages, and daily life you'll never be part of again. Some women stop opening letters, unable to bear the homesickness they bring. Others write responses they can never send. The nearest post office is 50 miles away, and stamps cost money better spent on food. These unsent letters pile up, conversations with ghosts, while the writers slowly become ghosts themselves. The lack of mental stimulation corrodes minds trained for more than survival. Educated women find themselves forgetting words, losing the ability to discuss anything beyond weather and crops. Books, when available, can read so many times the pages wear thin as tissue. One woman memorized the entire Bible not from devotion, but from desperate need for mental exercise. Another taught herself to recite Shakespeare from memory, standing in her dirt-floor kitchen performing Hamlet for an audience of mice and spiders. Men aren't immune to the isolation's effects. They develop what locals call prairie fever, a restlessness that drives them to abandon families and responsibilities. Some simply walk away one day, leaving wives and children to wonder if they're dead or just couldn't stand another minute of the emptiness. Others turn violent, the pressure of being the sole support and protector in a hostile land converting to rage. That explodes without warning. Domestic violence becomes as common as dust, hidden by distance and the frontier code that what happens in a man's home is his business alone. The seasonal patterns of isolation create their own torments. Summer might bring occasional visitors, traveling peddlers, neighbors passing through, but winter locks everyone in separate prisons of snow and cold. Blizzards can isolate a homestead for weeks. No possibility of travel, no way to know if the rest of the world still exists. Families run out of things to say to each other, sitting in silence broken only by the wind and the crack of ice forming on the walls. Cabin fever becomes literal, a crawling insanity that makes people do inexplicable things. The Johansons spent one entire winter without speaking, not from anger, but simply because they'd run out of words. When the spring thaw finally came and neighbors visited, they found the family had forgotten how to converse, responding to questions with nods and gestures, their voices rusty from disuse. It took months for them to remember how to be human again, and even then, they spoke in whispers, as if normal volume might shatter something fragile. Religious mania flourishes in the isolation. With no churches for hundreds of miles, people create their own interpretations of faith, often bizarre amalgamations of Christianity, superstition, and frontier folklore. Traveling preachers exploit this spiritual hunger, some sincere, others charlatans who leave communities poorer and more confused. Self-proclaimed prophets arise, usually men, whose minds have cracked under pressure, leading followers into increasingly strange practices. One group near the territorial border believed God spoke through prairie dogs and spent months trying to interpret their chattering. The absence of social structures that define civilized life unmoors people from their identities. Without shops, schools, churches, or community gatherings, the markers of normal existence disappear. Days blur together. Is it Tuesday or Thursday, June or July, the second or third year of this exile? Time becomes elastic, measured not in hours, but in seasons. Not in weeks, but in the spaces between tragedies. People forget birthdays, anniversaries, even how old their children are. Suicide becomes common, though families hide it when possible. The shame of mental weakness compounds the grief of loss. Women drink, lie, or poison themselves with wild plants. Men accidentally shoot themselves while cleaning guns. Some simply walk into blizzards or summer heat without water, choosing death over another day of soul-crushing loneliness. The survivors rarely speak of it, adding another layer of silence to lives already crushed by quietude. Those who endure develop coping mechanisms that seem mad to outsiders. They hold long conversations with livestock, attributing complex personalities to cows and chickens. They create elaborate rituals around daily tasks, finding comfort in repetition when everything else feels chaotic. Some develop obsessions. One woman collected every rock within a mile radius of her home, sorting them by size and color, creating patterns only she understood. Another counted everything, steps to the well, stirs of the pot, words spoken each day, as if quantifying existence could control it. The rare social gatherings become exercises in relearning human interaction. Barn raisings, harvests, or funerals bring people together who've forgotten how to behave in groups. Conversations are stilted, full of long pauses and sudden bursts of inappropriate laughter or tears. Children hide behind their mothers' skirts, terrified of strangers who might as well be from another planet. Adults drink too much, talk loud, desperate to squeeze months of social contact into a few hours. Even mail-order catalogs become windows to sanity. Women pore over them not to buy. Few can afford anything, but to remember that somewhere. People live differently. They memorize descriptions of dresses they'll never wear, furniture they'll never own, lives they'll never live. The catalogs get passed between homesteads like precious books, pages worn soft from handling. Wish books for people whose wishes have been ground to dust. The damage of isolation passes to the next generation. Children raised in this solitude struggle to integrate if the family eventually moves to town. They can't play normally with other children, don't understand social cues, speak too quietly, or not at all. Some never fully adapt, remaining forever marked by their prairie childhood, comfortable only in empty spaces that remind others of the isolation that nearly broke them. This is the hidden violence of frontier life, not the dramatic gunfights or Indian attacks of dime novels, but the slow dissolution of human consciousness in the face of relentless emptiness. The prairie doesn't need weapons to kill. It uses silence, distance, and time to erode sanity as surely as wind erodes soil. Survivors emerge changed, carrying an invisible weight that marks them as surely as any physical scar. They've looked into the void of absolute isolation and seen themselves disappear. And even if they return to civilization, part of them remains forever lost in that endless grass, howling with the wind. The gunshot echoes across the prairie at dawn, and you know before anyone tells you that another life has ended over something trivial. A disputed fence line, a poker debt, a perceived insult in the saloon. You've learned to distinguish the sounds. The sharp crack of a rifle means someone was shot from ambush. The deeper boom of a shotgun suggests close quarters murder. The rapid pops of pistol fire indicate a drunken confrontation gone deadly. Death comes so casually here that people place bets on who'll be next, treating human life as a commodity cheaper than bullets. The myth of the Wild West portrays violence as noble. Good guys in white hats facing down villains in dramatic showdowns. The reality is squalid, brutal, and utterly without honor. Most killings happen in the dark, shot in the back, ambushed while sleeping, murdered for possessions worth less than a decent meal. There's no law except what men enforce with guns. No justice except revenge. No protection except what you provide yourself. Your town, like most frontier settlements, exists in a state of permanent near anarchy. The sheriff, when there is one, usually has jurisdiction over an area larger than some eastern states, making enforcement impossible even if you were inclined to try. Most aren't. The position attracts to types, corrupt opportunists who use the badge to extort and steal, or violent men looking for legal cover for their bloodlust. Either way, calling the law usually brings more trouble than solutions. The Vigilance Committee, vigilantes, though they prefer the formal name, represents frontier justice at its worst. Composed of the town's leading citizens, meaning those with the most guns and least conscience, they meet in secret to decide who lives and dies. Their justice is swift, brutal, and often wrong. You've seen them lynch men for crimes they probably didn't commit. The real guilty parties sometimes standing in the mob, helping tie the noose. Last spring, they hanged Tom Morrison for horse theft. The evidence was circumstantial. He'd been seen near where the horses went missing, but Tom was a stranger, had no friends to speak for him, and the committee needed someone to blame. They dragged him from the boarding house at midnight, strung him up from the big cottonwood by the creek. Come morning, the missing horses wandered back on their own. They'd simply broken through a fence and gone exploring. Tom's body swayed in the wind for 3 days before someone cut him down. No one apologized. No one was held accountable. That's frontier justice. Saloons serve as flashpoints for violence. Mix desperate men, vodka whiskey, crooked gambling, and prostitutes, and bloodshed becomes inevitable. The Oriental Saloon averages to killings a month, usually over card games where everyone cheats and taking offense is easier than admitting you're too drunk to play. Bodies get dragged out back and left for whoever wants to deal with them. The sawdust on the floor isn't just for spilled drinks. It soaks up blood easier than bear would. You avoid the saloons, but violence finds you anyway. It's woven into the fabric of frontier life like thread and cloth. The rancher who decides your homestead infringes on his traditional grazing lands. Never mind your legal claim. The drifters who appear at your door demanding food, their intentions clear in their eyes. The tax collectors who aren't affiliated with any government but collect anyway, backed by drawn pistols. Every interaction carries the potential for deadly violence. Women face particular horrors in this lawless land. Rape is so common it's barely considered a crime unless the woman is married to someone important. Even then, justice usually means her male relatives killing the perpetrator in revenge, starting feuds that claim more lives than the original crime. Widows and women alone are considered fair game by predators who know there's no law to stop them. Some women dress as men for protection, binding their breasts and carrying guns. Trying to avoid notice, the Murphy family learned about frontier violence the hard way. Successful farmers with a good claim near water. They thought hard work and honesty would see them through. Then Ben Carter decided he wanted their land. First came offers to buy, which they refused, then threats, which they reported to the useless sheriff. Finally, violence. The barn burned one night. Accident, Carter claimed. Their cattle were shot. Wolves, Carter suggested. Then came the night riders, faces hidden, demanding they leave or die. Mr. Murphy stood firm. They found him. 2 days later, shot in the back while plowing. The family left within a week. Carter took the land. No investigation, no justice. Just another frontier murder that everyone knew about and no one could prove. Children grow up steeped in violence. Seeing their first corpse before they lose their baby teeth, they play hanging games, arguing over who gets to be the vigilante and who the horse thief. Boys practice quick draws with wooden guns, dreaming of the day they'll carry real iron. Girls learn to shoot too, knowing that being female offers no protection and might make them bigger targets. Childhood ends the first time they see someone they know killed over nothing. The violence creates a culture of paranoia. Everyone goes armed, pistols, knives, sometimes both. You learn to watch hands, not faces. In conversations, a man reaching for tobacco might be going for a weapon. Sitting with your back to a door marks you as either very brave or very stupid. Trust becomes a luxury more expensive than gold. Today's friend might be tomorrow's killer if circumstances change. If drought makes them desperate, if they decide your claim looks better than theirs. Blood feuds import old world vengeance to new world lawlessness. The Schneiders and the Kowalskis brought their European hatred to adjacent claims, continuing a conflict that started in villages neither would see again. It began with disputes over fence lines, escalated to poisoned wells and stolen livestock, finally erupted in gunfire. By the time the territorial marshal arrived, 3 months after the killing started, 7 men were dead, to women widowed, and enough orphans created to guarantee the feud would continue for generations. Even business transactions carry the threat of violence. Cattle buyers routinely cheat desperate ranchers, knowing that protests might mean a bullet. The general store extends credit at usurious rates, enforced by hired guns who break legs over $50 debts. The bank forecloses with impunity. The sheriff somehow always available to evict families, but never to investigate crimes against them. Economic violence and physical violence intertwine until they're indistinguishable. The code of the West, that romanticized honor system, is mostly myth. Men shoot each other over imagined slights because backing down means showing weakness, and weakness invites predation. He-needed killing becomes an actual legal defense, usually successful if the dead man was poor, foreign, or friendless. Self-defense stretches to cover any killing, where the victim was armed, even if shot while sleeping. After all, he might have woken up and posed a threat. Professional killers drift through towns like tumbleweeds, selling death for surprisingly small fees. $50 to remove an inconvenient homesteader, $100 to eliminate a business rival. These men, and occasional women, operate openly, everyone knowing their trade, but no one willing to confront them. They drink in the saloons, their presence casting shadows over conversations. Their departures often coinciding with sudden vacancies on nearby claims. Lynching becomes the frontier's favorite spectator sport, not just for horse thieves and murderers, but for anyone who offends the mob's sensibilities. Being foreign, especially Chinese or Mexican, can be a death sentence if troubles arise. Being black guarantees it. The crowds gather like it's a holiday. Men, women, even children lifted up to see better. Photos get taken, sold as souvenirs. The horror becomes normalized through repetition. You remember the lynching of the Grayson brothers. accused of rustling cattle from the big ranch owned by Mr. Thornton. The evidence was sketchy. Thornton's foreman claimed to have seen them near his herd, but the brothers had alibis. Didn't matter. Thornton wanted them gone, had the influence to make it happen. The mob dragged both boys, they were barely 18, from the jail. The sheriff conveniently disappeared. They hanged them from the railroad trestle, bodies dancing in the air while the crowd cheered. Later, the real rustlers were caught 3 counties over. No one mentioned the Graysons again. Women occasionally take justice into their own hands, driven to violence by the failure of any system to protect them. Mary Keller shot her husband after years of beatings that everyone knew about, but no one stopped. She walked into the saloon where he was drinking, put 3 bullets in his chest, then sat down to wait for whatever came next. The men in the bar, who'd watched Jim Keller beat her bloody in public more than once, suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. No charges were filed. Mary runs the homestead alone now, and no man bothers her. Word travels. This omnipresent violence warps everything it touches. Business deals require armed negotiation. Social gatherings simmer with tension, everyone aware that alcohol and old grudges might explode into gunfire. Churches preach peace while congregants sit with pistols in their laps. Schools, when they exist, teach lessons interrupted by the sound of gunshots from the street. Children learn arithmetic by calculating ammunition costs and reading by studying wanted posters. The morning sun rises over the prairie like a curse, illuminating another day in this endless nightmare of survival. You've endured the journey, built your pathetic shelter, fought for water, buried your dead, and survived the violence that surrounds you like dust. But now comes the special hells reserved for women and children, the economic devastation that crushes dreams into powder finer than prairie dirt, and the slow, inevitable death of hope itself. As you lie in your dugout, listening to your daughter's labored breathing from another illness you can't treat, you wonder how long a human spirit can endure before it simply stops. Women's particular hell of frontier life is brutal for men. For women, it's a special kind of torture designed by a malevolent God. You came west as someone's daughter, wife, or sister, never just yourself. Your identity exists only in relation to men who brought you to this desolation and now expect you to somehow maintain civilization in a soddy with a dirt floor. The work never ends, cooking over buffalo chip fires that coat everything with acrid smoke, washing clothes in water so alkaline it burns your hands raw, mending and remending clothing that falls apart faster than you can fix it. But the work is nothing compared to the pregnancies. You're pregnant again, the 8th time in 10 years. The baby's buried by the creek, one loss on the trail, another to scarlet fever last winter. The ones who survive drain your body of nutrients it can't spare, leaving you gap-toothed and hollow at 30. There's no midwife for 50 miles, no doctor for 100. You'll deliver this baby like the others, alone except for a neighbor woman if you're lucky, your husband if you're not. The fear starts months before labor, knowing that 1 in 8 women die in childbirth out here, usually from hemorrhaging that no one knows how to stop. Martha Brennan bled to death after delivering twins. The second baby turned wrong, her screams echoing across the prairie for hours before merciful unconsciousness took her. Sarah Jo Hansen developed childbed fever, her body rotting from the inside while her newborn starved because no other woman could wet nurse. You've seen women tear so badly they never heal, right? Living the rest of their shortened lives in constant pain and humiliation, wearing rags to catch the leakage that never stops. The isolation hits women harder because society expects you to maintain standards impossible in this wasteland. Back east, women gathered for sewing circles, church socials, afternoon teas. Here, you might go 6 months without seeing another woman's face. The loneliness eats at your mind like acid. You find yourself talking to the chickens in full conversations, asking their opinions on the weather, telling them about your childhood. When you realize you're waiting for them to answer, the cold grip of madness tightens around your throat. Violence against women is casual, constant, and unpunished. The 2 drifters who forced their way into the Carlson place while Mr. Carlson was gone didn't just rob, they spent 3 days there, and Mrs. Carlson hasn't spoken since. Everyone knows what happened, but she won't say and the law won't ask. Widows become targets within days of burying their husbands. The Murphy widow held off 3 men with a shotgun for 2 hours before they set her barn on fire to smoke her out. What happened next drove her to drink lie rather than live with the shame. Even marriage offers little protection. Frontier law says a man can't rape his wife, she's his property, to use as he sees fit. Beatings are considered private matters. You've seen women in town with black eyes and split lips buying supplies. While everyone pretends not to notice, Mrs. Henderson's arm hangs funny from where her husband broke it last winter. She told the doctor she fell. He didn't question it. Why bother? There's no law against a man disciplining his wife, no shelter for women who flee, nowhere to run in this endless emptiness. Children of the brutal frontier children born into this hell never know innocence. They learn to walk in houses where death visits regularly, speak their first words in an atmosphere of constant fear, play games interrupted by violence and tragedy. Childhood is a luxury the frontier can't afford. By 5, they're working, gathering buffalo chips for fuel, feeding chickens, watching younger siblings while mother labors in the fields. By 10, they're doing adult work with bodies too small for the task. You watch your own children fading like flowers in drought. Their growth stunts from malnutrition, their minds dulled by isolation and lack of education. The school, when one finally opens, operates 3 months a year if you're lucky. The teacher is usually a young woman barely literate herself, working for starvation wages until she marries or dies. Your children learn to read from the Bible and old newspapers, do arithmetic by calculating survival. How many pounds of flour until spring? How many bullets left for hunting? The games children play reflect their reality. Funeral is popular. They take turns being the corpse while others practice grief. They play Indian raid, hanging, and starvation winter. Their dolls made from corn husks die of cholera and childbed fever. Boys practice quick draw with sticks, dreaming of the day they'll carry real guns and extract their own justice. Girls play house in holes dug in the ground. Their make-believe homes as miserable as their real ones. Disease takes children with mechanical efficiency, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough. They sweep through in waves, emptying schoolhouses and filling graveyards. You've attended so many child funerals that the words of the service echo in your dreams. The small coffins, hastily built from precious wood, hardly seem large enough to hold a life. Yet they hold entire futures. All the possibilities ended before they began. Economic desperation and broken dreams. The economic reality of frontier life makes mockery of the American dream. You came here believing hard work would yield prosperity. That free land meant opportunity. Instead, you've discovered a system designed to extract everything while giving nothing back. The railroads that promise to bring civilization instead bring price manipulation. That ensures you'll never profit from your labor. Grain that costs you blood and sweat to grow sells for less than the seed cost, while supplies you need cost 10 times their value back east. The general store operates like a medieval fiefdom. Henderson extends credit at rates that would shame a loan shark, knowing you have nowhere else to go. Salt that costs pennies in Kansas City sells for dollars. Here, when you can't pay, and eventually no one can pay, he takes your land, your livestock, your tools. The ledger book where he tracks debts might as well be written in blood. Families work themselves to death trying to pay off charges that compound faster than any harvest can cover. Banks prey on desperation with surgical precision. They loan money for improvements, wells, fencing, equipment. Knowing drought or grasshoppers will prevent repayment. When you default, they take everything. The Schmidts worked their claim for 7 years, built it from nothing into a marginally productive farm. One bad harvest and the bank took it all. Mr. Schmidt shot himself in their barn the day before eviction. Mrs. Schmidt and the children joined the growing population of frontier refugees, heading back east with nothing but shame and empty bellies. The town builders arrive like locusts, promising prosperity while extracting wealth. They plat townships on paper, sell lots to desperate investors, collect their money and disappear before anyone realizes the town is just surveyor's stakes. In an empty field, the railroad speculators are worse, spreading rumors of new lines that will never be built, driving land prices up before the crash that leaves everyone except them ruined. Even successful harvests bring no relief. Getting grain to market means dealing with railroad monopolies that charge shipping rates. Designed to consume profits, grain elevators collude to fix prices at starvation levels. Middlemen take cuts at every stage until what reaches your pocket. Wouldn't feed a chicken, you grow food you can't afford to eat. Raise cattle you can't afford to keep, all while the system's architects grow fat on your misery. The slow death of hope. This is where the frontier truly breaks people, not in the dramatic disasters, but in the slow grinding away of hope. You came here with dreams of prosperity, of building something to leave your children. Now, after years of struggle, you own less than when you started. The land that was supposed to be your salvation has become your prison. You can't afford to stay, can't afford to leave, trapped in an economic and geographic purgatory with no escape. The letters you write home become fiction, painting success where none exists because admitting failure would break what little pride remains. You tell your mother about the improvements to the farm, not mentioning their repairs to storm damage you can't actually afford. You describe your children as growing strong, not adding that they're growing strong in the way weeds do, tough, scrape thin, adapted to deprivation. Neighbors who arrive full of determination now move like ghosts through their daily routines. The Petersons don't talk anymore, not from anger, but from having nothing left to say. The Wilsons' eldest son left for California, promising to send money that never comes. Their daughter married at 14 to a man 3 times her age because his farm has a real house, and sometimes enough food. These aren't lives, they're slow deaths punctuated by faster ones. The cemetery expands faster than the town. New sections open each year, one for children, one for women dead in childbirth, one for suicides, though they don't call it that. The graves start with carved headstones, then wooden crosses, finally just mounds of earth as even the energy for proper burial fades. The prairie reclaims them quickly, grass growing over dreams and bones alike until no trace remains of the lives ground to dust. In pursuit of an impossible promise, mental breakdown becomes so common it has categories. Prairie madness for women who crack under isolation, frontier fever for men who abandon families to chase rumors of gold or simply to escape, child melancholy for young ones who stop speaking, stop playing, stop hoping. The asylum in the state capital has a whole wing for frontier failures, people whose minds chose madness over accepting this reality. The final reckoning, and so you reach the end, not a life, necessarily, though that may come to, but a belief. In the frontier myth, the Wild West isn't wild, it's empty. Not empty of people or animals or weather, but empty of the promise that lured you here. It's a void that consumes human effort and gives back nothing but suffering. The romance of frontier life is revealed as the cruelest lie ever sold to desperate. People die, you think of the journey that brought you here, that trail of graves marking the price of admission to this hell. You think of friends lost to disease, neighbors driven mad by isolation, children dead before their time. You think of the violence that permeates everything like dust, the starvation that gnaws even in times of relative plenty, the water that poisons while it sustains. You think of women aged decades and years, children who never knew childhood, men broken by the weight of failure they can't escape. The true brutality of the frontier isn't in its individual hardships, it's in their relentlessness. Back east, tragedy strikes but passes. Here, it compounds daily, each disaster building on the last until the weight crushes even the strongest spirit. You survive not by overcoming but by enduring, not by thriving but by dying slower than the things trying to kill you. Some will make it through luck, ruthlessness, or simple refusal to die. A few will build the towns and farms that future generations will inherit. But for every success story trumpeted by land speculators and railroad agents, 100 failures lie forgotten in unmarked graves. The Wild West will be won, eventually, but the price will be paid in currency too dear to calculate. Human lives, sanity, hope, and dignity all sacrificed to the implacable demands of an indifferent land as dawn breaks over another day you're not sure you want to see. You understand the truth the boosters and speculators never mention. The frontier doesn't make you free. It makes you its prisoner, body and soul, until death provides the only escape from the brutal reality of trying to carve civilization from a land that wants you dead. The American dream becomes the American nightmare, and waking up offers no relief because the nightmare is your life, stretching endlessly across the prairie like the grass that will eventually cover your unmarked grave. The silence returns, broken only by the wind and the labored breathing of those still clinging to existence. This is how the West was really won, not with glory, but with grief, not with courage, but with mere stubborn refusal to admit defeat even when defeat surrounds you, like the very air you breathe. And tomorrow, if you survive tonight, you'll do it all again, because what else is there to do but endure until endurance itself becomes a kind of death, and death becomes a kind of mercy in this land of brutal truths and beautiful lies.